back to another episode of the Industry Edge podcast, where we talk with leaders working in and for the hardest working industries such as manufacturing, distribution, construction, and more. Some past guests include Dustin Dowdy from Southeastern Tank, Michelle Boykin of Rackley Roofing, and Sean Jones, president of Toyota Material Handling Mid-South. This episode is brought to you by K&C Marketing. K&C is a full-service marketing agency that helps B2B industrial companies grow their brand and increase sales. They serve as either a fully outsourced marketing partner or supplement in-house marketing teams. To learn more about K&C's brand development, marketing, and website services, visit kncmarketingagency.com. Now, today I have Dr. Jeremy Weisz. Jeremy has been featuring top entrepreneurs with video interviews since 2008 that include founders and CEOs of Pixar, P90X, Atari, Einstein Bagels, Mattel, Kettle Chips, RX Bars, Big League Chew, the Orlando Magic, and many more on inspiredinsider.com. He runs Rise25, where they help B2B businesses connect to their dream 200 clients, referral partners, and get ROI using a podcast. They eliminate 99% of the work and make sure that you get ROI. Rise25 is an easy button for you to launch and run your podcast. Jeremy, thank you so much for being here today.
I'm
Welcome to the.
excited. Thanks for having me.
I'm
And I
excited.
agree, it is like the hardest working industry, those industries you're talking about. It's some of them are doing like three shifts and it's crazy.
Yeah, it's rough and tough. It's no funny business, that's for sure. I completely agree. So, well, I'm gonna start it off pretty easy. So, first question, I know you were initially a chiropractor for by trade back in the day before you started Rise25. So, how in the world did you shift from chiropractor to podcasting?
It's a great question. So my background's in biochemistry. I studied biochemistry in Madison, Wisconsin, and I went on a chiropractic school. My dad suffered with really bad neck pain when I was growing up, and the only thing that helped him was the chiropractor. So I decided at that point that's what I wanted to do. And so I went in and I ended up working for the chiropractor as an internship before I went to with the chiropractor to help my dad. And I just saw people come in with a frown and leave with a smile. So I decided that's what I wanted to do. And I love the health field and just everything about it. When I started my practice, they amazing job about the human body and help, healing, crappy on teaching anything related to business. And so when I had my own practice, I went and was going to marketing conferences and business conferences to learn more on that side of things because it's a whole nother skill set. And what I learned early on, this was like around 2006, and I started to talk to people who were doing, internet marketing stuff online. And I came across a few people doing this podcasting thing. At that point, most people didn't know what a podcast was. And it really took to it because one of my core philosophies is just giving. I try and give as much as humanly possible to people. And I found, wow, and I love education and professional development. So just learning. And I geek out on talking to other founders and entrepreneurs. So it was like a perfect combination. Like, wow, I could have people talk to anyone I want, invite them on my show, ask them what I want, and really learn and connect with them and profile them. This is great. And so I started doing that at this point, maybe over 15 years ago. And by the way, it had nothing to do with chiropractic or health or anything. I just loved talking to other founders and entrepreneurs and learning from them specifically. And what happened was people started coming to me asking them to help them with their podcast. And so over time, it turned into a separate business on accident. So I was still running the chiropractic and massage office. And I had started getting all these clients asking me to help them with the strategy and the execution of their podcast. And so at one point, it just got too busy. I couldn't do both. And so I ended up selling the chiropractic practice and focusing 100% of my time and energy on Rise 25. So it wasn't like an overnight thing, but it was a kind of a slow progression. And since the whole team is virtual, it didn't matter where I was at that point. But it was again, I always tell people podcasting. You could take everything else from me, just don't take my podcast away from my business because I have formed relationships that I've gone to people's weddings. I've gone on family vacations with people. I've just formed best friends through who I meet and talk to on the podcast.
That's amazing. Holy cow. I feel like being able to have you have that degree, chiropractor, and then using those are two very different career paths, like being a people person, wanting to learn about people, and then also, so that's a huge pivot. Was it really hard to make that decision, or was it a very obvious one when you knew and you knew for sure you were going this
It's
way?
a great question. Like over time, I have my practice for 15 years or so. And I had been practicing at that point maybe for 18 years. So it's not like people say, "Do you miss it?" I mean, I do have a table right here. I don't know if people are watching the video. There is one right behind this sign here. So it's mostly a family come in and they want an adjustment. So I still get my fill with family. But was it was a slow progression over time, and there's something about being location independent that was nice, because um, when my practice was in Chicago, in the city, and then we eventually moved to the suburbs, and my commute was not pleasurable, okay, like in traffic. And so I love treating patients and I loved helping people, but like there were other aspects that I didn't love, like having to show up into an office every day. And then the hours are different because people want to come before work and after work. So the hours of the day were long. And I like to be accommodating too. So we had long office hour availabilities too. So there's certain things I love and there's certain things I will never miss about it. But it's kind of it's a new nice transition when I you know did it 100% full time, and not have managing both. And I was working long hours on both because sometimes I was working pieces of the day. I would segment my day. Like sometimes it was before, who knows, I was doing stuff from like 7 to 9 or 9:30. Then I was doing something from 12 to 3. And then I was doing something from, you know, 6 to 8. And then I was doing something from 11 p.m. to 2 in the morning. So like it was a lot managing both.
Yep, I can imagine. That would be a lot for sure. You said that you first like were introduced to kind of the podcast world at a conference or a trade show or something like that. So on that note, like for companies that rely heavily on those kinds of events for marketing and sales, trade shows, direct sales, traditional forms of marketing, how have you seen a podcast be able to like complement those activities for businesses or even surpass those kind of efforts?
Yeah, that's a so I've done podcasts for conferences, so I can speak to this. And I've also there's a couple things. One, if I think of it as a great way to follow up, like podcasts in general, I think of as just a way to giving to someone. Like right now, you're giving to me because you're allowing me to share my thought leadership on the topic, and then we're going to share it afterwards. So it's just a big thank you to the guest, big give to the guest. And so one is follow up. Like when I'm at a conference, let's say I met you at a conference, how do I follow up with you? Right? I don't even know how I'd follow up with someone without a podcast. Like an easy follow up for me is, hey, Danielle, I would love to have you on my show. Why don't we follow up after this?
Mhm.
And I'd love to profile you and your company. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Sometimes what I'll do is um, I will whip out my phone and I'll do an episode. Like it's 5 minutes and maybe follow up with a longer episode or maybe not. But I'll be like, I realized this, Daniel, like I started bringing, it sounds geeky, But like to some conference, I'll bring like a selfie stick. I won't be holding it, taking pictures, but like I'll have it because if I want to do an interview, I want to just hold the phone out, right? And so I may go, hey, I just want to ask you one question. And it may be 5 minutes, right? It's just like, we may be talking about leadership. I love to talk about whatever the topic of leadership or whatever. And so then now I record the episode and I publish it. And then I can follow up with here's an actual piece of content we put out, right?
Mhm.
And that could be put on social media and it could be, amplified in other places. So, it's a great follow up.
Mhm.
You could do it right then and there, or you could do it after the fact. And then obviously from a repurposing perspective, it's a blog post, it's an audio, it could be a video. You could repurpose it into social media, which
Mhm.
I know that you guys do a great job for companies. Like they need content for their social media. And so, um, yeah. And also, by the way, ahead of time, I am, we talked about this before we hit record. We talked about like extroverted introvert. So I'm like, I am extroverted by the pure definition, meaning I gain energy from people, right? But I am not from, if you're like, oh, this person's like the life of the party, they're sort of outgoing, because I'm kind of reserved, even shy a little bit in big groups. So, like, what it allows me to do is to connect with people ahead of time. And sometimes I'll look at and see maybe someone's speaking, maybe someone's exhibiting, maybe they're sponsoring, and I'll connect with them ahead of time, have them on my show ahead of time. So I'll try and maybe have on 5 or 10 people. I'm going to a show for the first time and I don't know anyone. And then I get to go up to them and we're like old friends,
Yeah.
right? And so I'll go up and like, hello, hey Jeremy, how's it going? So now I know a bunch of people, even though I had never been to that conference. I remember went to a conference um, in San Diego for the first time, and I knew like 50 people because over the course of that year, I mean, it was a big conference with thousands of people, but I was like, I don't want to show up and just like sit in the corner by myself because I probably end up doing that. And so I made a concerted effort to reach out. And so I knew probably over 50 people there, and I felt like I had a group of old friends.
That's amazing. It's such a warmer, like it just makes everything so much more warm versus, and I think from a sales perspective, it's like you get so many spammy emails a day with all sorts of stuff. And it's like, that's not, those people are asking you for something. Whereas a podcast, you're asking them like, hey, I'd love to have you on, and you're giving them something. So it's shifting the narrative completely.
Yeah,
So
you're exactly right. Like most emails are like, here are my services, or here's this, and it's like, hey, I would love to have you talk about what you do. It's the
mhm.
opposite.
Yep, totally. I love that. So, okay, companies, they want to see tangible results. Like they're not going to keep paying for service, like a service or a podcast or marketing or whatever you call it, if you don't, give them results and ROI. And you guys talk about, ROI being a big part of what you guys do for businesses. So, how do you ensure a podcast delivers ROI for the people that you do work with?
Yeah. Well, one is it's funny, and you may relate to this, but if someone listens to what we do, it works because it's a system. But they have to do it. So people have to be a bit coachable, like to just listen. And it kind of starts with, and this is not rocket science, right? What we're talking about, it's really relationships, and the way I think of it is how do we give to our best relationships? Or how do we give to our best potential relationships? So the first thing we talk about really is create your dream 200. And the Dream 200, some people think of it as just like clients, but for us, we think of it as clients. It could be strategic or referral partners. It could be just authorities in that particular industry, whatever that industry is. And to really formulate a list of a Dream 200 and, under those categories. So, like, for me, I've been releasing 2 to 3 episodes a week for over a decade. I tend to feature and profile a lot of um, people who are great partners. And partnerships go both ways. Partners are people I can refer to, partners are people that they could potentially refer to us, right? And so if I think about over the course of a year, I may have 150 episodes. I'm not saying everyone will do 150 episodes, right? If someone does once a week, maybe they only have 52 episodes. But let's say 80% of my episodes are partnerships, like people who are potential partners, they're on the Dream 200 partnership. Um, then I may have 100 partners this year that I've had on my podcast. Okay. So if only 10% of those, so only 10 people refer us one person, that is again, we're talking B2B here, of course. Like this isn't, we're not selling like a $5 widget, but so if 10 people, like I'm sure the people you work with in manufacturing, their client lifetime value may be 100,000, 200,000, $1 million, maybe more. So if we're thinking, okay, you have 100 partners, you get 10 of those people actually refer someone, that's 10 people, just multiply that by a client lifetime value of a business. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And then month two, or sorry, year two. So year one, let's say I have 100 partners. Year two, I have 100 partners. Year three, I have 100 partners. Year four, I have 100 partners. Over 10 years, right? I have 1,000 partners that I've talked to and 100. So it accumulates, it compounds. So when I talk about ROI, there's a money piece, right? Like someone refers business or they become a client. Sometimes people go into both those categories. The second is a time is also ROI. So
Mhm.
like you're recording, people record episodes and share their knowledge on certain topics. And so maybe instead of talking to someone for 30 minutes, maybe you'd have this conversation with 5 different people for 30 minutes or an hour a month. You save 5 hours a month every month. So like it leverages someone's time because they're sharing their thought leadership in an episode that they can now share with anyone. So there's a time element of ROI, you know?
Yeah, that's true. Like not just the money piece, but time is money too. So that's
Yeah.
so true. I've not thought about it like that, but I love that because then they can go share it and say, hey, I was on this podcast, and who knows what that could do for them and their business. I love
The
it.
foundation thing you were asking though is like that we talk about is creating a Dream 200 first. Because there's a lot, anyone could talk into a mic and publish it on YouTube, right? That the key is having a specific strategy and plan to make it work for the business, right? And so it comes down to the foundational piece, which is like, who are the people and industries that someone wants to be talking to?
Yeah, that that makes sense. So yeah, talk to me more about that. The Dream 200 strategy, like can you break that down a bit more?
Yeah,
And what would be the first step that a company should take to identify and connect with those partner? Like where
yeah.
would they?
That's a great. So Dream 200, I kind of break it up into there's warm relationships and cold relationships, right? And what people often want to do with this when we're brainstorming with someone in a company, they want to go to the coldest of cold. They're like, here's like, maybe it's like, and it's not bad, but it's like, here's like 3 companies on our hit list. How do we get a hold of them? And oftentimes we find people jump over the warm piece and go straight to the cold. So the lowest hanging fruit is in the warm relationships, the people who already know, like, and trust someone. And so what we always do is, and it goes back to the giving piece, which is I I talk to people, make a list of the people, your best champions, your best partners, the best people in your universe, and start with them, and then basically find ways to give to those people on an ongoing basis. One of the ways I do it is I have them on the podcast. I mention them on the podcast. I try and help them. Once they're on the podcast, we'll do a social media post on them about the episode. I'll just so I tell people when we're talking about it, I tell people make a list those people and just send them a message, a text, an email, and just say, like, I'd love to hear what are you working on? How can I help you? And it's not even about me. It's about how can I help them? Maybe I'll post about them on social. Like, just what are the ways I can give to them, you
Yep.
know?
Yep.
So that's the warm piece. And the cold piece, obviously people want to break into certain, get more exposure or clients. And the cold piece I think of, there's kind of five categories in the cold piece that I think about, and it depends on the industry. We'll take, I don't know if you want to take manufacturing as industry, but there's even niche within manufacturing, right? There's the car industry, there's the farming industry. So I think of um, partners, strategic partners, and referral partners. What are the categories from a cold relationship standpoint? So I think of who are consultants in the space. Like we're talking, manufacturing. Like you do all this work for manufacturing companies and marketing for manufacturing companies. Consultants have a specific, they may be, I'm making this up, but like a consultant to help farmers or like a company grow more crops or do more or be like, I don't know, integrate leadership. It's not something you do, but they may have 50 clients who have manufacturing companies, right? So who are the consultants in a specific industry? Who are the trade associations in an industry? What are the conferences in the industry? What are the software in the industry? And it could be speakers or authors because usually they're monetizing their services differently than your company may. So those are kind of how I think about the cold relationships. I'll give you an example. Like even there's a client who is a financial advisor, right? And so when we were talking about this, financial advisor, I'm like, well, who's your ideal client? Anyone with a lot of money, right? So I can invest it. I'm like, well, that's not really a
Right.
niche, right? And so we were looking at, I'm like, well, who are your best clients? And, best clients are like, who do you get the best results from and love working with? And when we looked at their list, it was all over the place. But there was like, listen, wait, 30% of these people are dentists. Did you realize that? Okay, no. Okay. So we looked at who were, even though they're a financial advisor, they could help anyone, of course, but like that's not really clear or specific. Like,
Mhm.
okay, who are the dental consultants? Who are the dental practice management companies? What are the dental trade associations? What are the dental conferences? What are the dental softwares? We got really clear on all of a sudden. So one of the people they had on their show was a someone who ran a dental. They were a dental they ran a dental practice management company, but they also had a conference. So they had them on their podcast. After the podcast, the person said, "Hey, why don't you come and be my guest at my conference? It's coming up in a couple weeks." By the way, the ticket to the conference I think was like a couple $1,000s. It was not inexpensive, and the person's like, "I'm happy to gift it to you. Thank you for having me on the show." So the person goes, "Sure." Went to the dental conference, and this person who owned the conference and a big practice management group in the industry was introducing this person around to all of the major players. And this person literally just started to specialize in decided they were going to specialize in dentists. So it didn't take very long, and it went into kind of that person hit two of the categories in
Mhm.
that group, if that makes sense.
Yep. That's so interesting. That's so cool. Like the fact that you guys were able to identify that. And it's like, wasn't like it was a majority of their business, but it was a unique part. And then it's almost like that back door. Like you get that little side door to your ideal client. Because I think that's what, when we talk with sales leaders or different people like that, it's like they want that direct contact of the big big kahuna, they want that and they don't know how to get it. And that's how we got to try to find it. Well, looking from those multiple angles could be your way in. And it's like you're only single track minded thinking about that particular contact when there's a bunch of back doors that you could potentially be knocking on or trying to get that. And then it's a warm introduction, not a cold one. I love that.
100%.
Sneaky, 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 but in a good way. I like it. That's awesome. Um, our like a lot of our clients, like you've been mentioning, manufacturers, distributors, a lot of industrial, like those rugged companies, construction. What kind of success have you seen for those types of companies or industries in the podcasting space that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, we've worked with almost, I'm not say every industry under the sun, but so many random industries. And, as long, again, what I said, we don't do true crime podcasts or comedy podcasts or sports podcasts, but if it's a B2B type of business, then we've had pest control company, like all the most random niches you've ever seen. And it's the same concept, right? It's how do you give to your network of people? So it starts off with creating that Dream 200, right? And so if that person or that company wants to get a hold of, um, you know, the authorities in a specific space, it doesn't work any differently from we've had, a leadership coach to a software company to a digital agency to a manufacturing company to a event company that serves corporations.
Mhm.
It's all the same concept, right? Um, Regardless, the fundamentals work because it's just about giving to their network. I'll give you an example. This, I mean, they're, I guess you could say they're they do manufacturing within their business, and it's more like in the um, orthodontic and dental space. So they manufacture um, retainers.
Mhm.
Okay. So again, we're talking kind of like a niche within a niche here, but um, Retainer Club. They basically will manufacture for orthodontic offices, so they don't have to um, do it themselves, and they can actually outsource it in everything with it. So when we talked to them, there were some big players in the space that were, I don't want to say ghosting them, but like, people are busy, and so they weren't responding, and they didn't respond for like whatever, hadn't responded for 6 months. We said, hey, why don't you reach out and have them on the show, get some, people from their network on the show. So they reached out. They're like, listen, Jeremy, have not been messaging us for 6 months. They're not going to respond. I'm like, it's a different message
Mhm.
to have them on. And so they messaged this person, and I think it was within an hour. The person messaged back and said, sure. And then recommended a client, like one of the people in their network, to use, not for a guest even, but they could have, to use their services. And it resulted in over $100,000 annual recurring client for them. Okay. And let me just say this. This is an interesting point, Danielle, for this piece. This is before they even launched the podcast. So the podcast there wasn't one episode live yet. And the person hadn't come on yet. They said, yeah, I'll come on. Actually, I thought of someone that may be interesting for what you do and introduce them. So that was $100,000 recurring client before the podcast launched. Okay. So again, the fundamentals don't change
Mhm.
with any of these industries because it's like, okay, I'm giving to these people, I'm profiling them, I'm trying to serve them. And like a mentor and friend, colleague, Brian Kurtz, he wrote the book Over Deliver. He talks about 100 0. meaning like I'll give 100% to you. I'm not expecting anything in return. So like, yes, would I like something to happen? Sure, but like I'm not expecting that. I don't have an expectation like, oh, they better refer me. I don't, that's not the mentality I go in with it. I'm just like, how can I help? How can I help? How can I help? And um, if good things happen, they happen, right?
That's a great perspective to have. And that's also a crazy story. And what the heck? Like they followed up, followed up, followed up, and it was not working. And all they said was, "Hey, do you want to join the podcast?" Boom. Oh my gosh. That's nuts. Just switching up the strategy a little bit. And it's just the power of like the timing too, because they might have been thinking about their person that they referred to that day. And then that was the only reason they responded is because they needed, somebody to refer that service to. So that's
I mean,
crazy.
when you're featuring someone and then when you publish the episode, you're constantly top of mind,
Mm-hmm.
for that person, right?
Yeah.
And so they're going to think about your services just because you're top of mind, when they may not have thought of your services at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I love that. That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Um, Another question along those lines. So it's in podcasting is very, like I've said, foreign to people. It's very, I listen to podcasts, but I would have never had any idea on where to start on how to get started. Do I need this piece of equipment? Do I need a special camera? Do I need a microphone? I feel like those are a lot of the questions that you think of instead of just like, I know I want to do a podcast and I know that it would be impactful. Like everybody's scared of the time and just the like the foreignness of it. What would you say to kind of ease people's minds
Yeah.
about that? Like they know they want to do it, but they just don't know really where to start as far as like the tactics and the things they need.
Yeah, that is probably the most common question that we get because, and by the way, I tell people the most important part is the strategy, right? Because people worry about the equipment, and if you get the strategy wrong, you, someone's going to waste their time, energy, and money. But so the equipment side, it's very simple. I mean, we keep it very simple. Okay, you need two things, right? You need I mean, you don't even need two things, but like a USB mic, a mic that plugs into your computer, right? Which you get for like $100 on Amazon. Okay. This one is a Blue Yeti. I think it's $150. I have an ATR 2100 over there, which is like $99 on Amazon. They both sound nice, right? So you need a mic, right? Because it just sounds better that way. And then you just need a platform to record, right? At the time of this recording, like I used to, we were talking before we hit record, in 2006, really the option was Skype. I was using because I wanted to do video. So Skype video was really, Zoom didn't exist. All these platforms didn't exist. So I was using Skype video. Now I tell people just use whatever you normally use for your meetings. People have virtual meetings. If you use Zoom, use Zoom. If you use Microsoft Teams, use Microsoft Teams. If you use Google Meeting, use Google Meeting. Like it doesn't matter. I mean, some people like argue, well, this one has better video quality than this one, and but in the end, you know, you're not going to be producing a commercial out of this that's going to go on NBC. So it's not the medium is not for that. Okay. Even we have people who do produce high level video commercials. And I just have to say, listen, don't compare the podcast to your commercial that's going on TV. It's not the same medium. And they go, okay, cool. So you just need that recording and a USB mic, and that's it.
Mhm.
From the technology setup. All the rest of the stuff is the most important stuff.
Mhm.
But it's
Yep.
as simple as that.
Hmm. Yep. Don't overthink it. Everyone gets scared.
No.
Thinks
I
that.
mean, I knew someone, I was talking to someone a couple months ago, Danielle, that they were like, they referred to us and like, I heard you guys can help with the podcast. And I'm like, oh, what, he's just like, yeah, I've been thinking about doing this podcast for 3 years. I'm like, oh, cool. Okay, that's great. Why haven't you done it? It's like, I don't know. And they go, I already bought, like 3 years ago, they bought $3,000 worth of equipment. And
Oh
I
my,
go, what did you possibly get? Like, I don't even know what you got. Like, I have lights here. I mean, you can get lights, and they're like $100 on Amazon. I mean, I'm like, I have no idea. What did you spend $3,000 on? I kind of want to know. But people will spend money and think about the equipment before, and I guess it's satisfied their need at the time. So like them buying the equipment was almost like, okay, I took a step towards doing the podcast, but then they still never did anything for a couple of years.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. You just gotta
But
go for. You don't even need the mic.
it
I'm
doesn't need to, yeah.
no
Well,
mic.
you're saying the camera, I
Yeah.
mean, most of the computer have a camera on there, so you don't need that. I mean, I think I bought one. I didn't get a crazy one. I just went and looked at the best reviews one on Amazon. It was like you can get, again, they range huge, right? But you can get for 100, 150, $200, you can get a nice
Yep.
camera for your
Yep.
computer. But you could also just use the one that's on your computer if you have that.
Yep. Just jump in. Do it
Yeah.
scared. Do it without all the
Yeah.
the fancy stuff and then figure it
Yeah.
out, right? I like it. Okay. Well, this has been awesome. I have one final question that I want to ask you just because all of the big companies that you've interviewed some really big ones. What are some of the most memorable moments or most like when you look back at some really cool interviews, what's a couple that you are most memorable to you and why?
Yeah, I'll pick a couple from a couple different niches. One, I had the co-founder of Pixar on, and so
I hoped you would say that because
his
I'm
was
a big
really.
Disney buff. So I
Oh,
was
you
like,
are
oh, totally. I was like, Pixar. I'm like, oh yeah, I geek out. I read, what's the book with Buzz Lightyear on it? He was the Ted.
Toy Story. What is it?
No, I have a Pixar book that I read. It's somewhere in my office. I'll have to find it. But
Who
it
wrote
like,
it? Ed Catmull, maybe.
I don't know. Look it
Okay.
up. But anyway, I
Was it
was,
called Creativity? I'm looking up.
yes,
Or there's two Pixar and Beyond. That's another one. There's a bunch of them. Yeah.
yes. It was a creativity one. Creativity and it had red, it was, is it a red cover? Anyway,
Yes, Ed Catmull wrote that. Yep.
yeah, that one. Ed,
Yep.
not Ted. Yep. Anyway, so I saw that. I was like, "Ah, that's so cool. I'm just like, I geek out off anything Disney and Pixar.
What's interesting is I don't know, I guess never ceases to amaze me with the successful founders that their journey was crazy. I mean, sometimes I go in, I'm like, oh yeah, they have it all put together, and then you talk to them, like they're experiencing the same issues as everyone else, and it's been a crazy journey. And just to think of the giving piece, so I had Alvy Ray Smith was a co-founder of Pixar with Ed Catmull, who wrote, Creativity Inc., which most people know Ed Catmull, who Ed Catmull is. But I was reading the Walter Isaacson's book, Steve Jobs's biography by Walter Isaacson, and they mentioned Alvy Ray Smith in the book when I was listening to it. Um, and I'm like, I've never heard of this person before. I wonder why I kept hearing Ed Catmull, but never Alvary Smith. And so I reached out to him and said, hey, why don't people talk about you? Like, you're like the co-founder of Pixar. And so we got into a conversation via email, and I said, I would love to feature your story on my podcast. And he was super, like, oh my God, he's the nicest person. He's like, I'll say not genius, but like he was a PhD in computer science from Stanford, and he knew at what point the technology would be good enough to produce something like Toy Story, because at the time it was way before its time. Um, but what was interesting, he told some Steve Jobs stories, he told some George Lucas stories. Um, it's all an Inspired Insider on the podcast. But what was interesting is just the crazy journey of just getting it started because they were at a boardroom table. They thought they were going to get funding. Um, and the people backed out and they were in the car on the way to the airport, and they're like, we're stuck. And Steve Jobs had offered them money to, I think it was like $5 million, um, to start Pixar, to fund it. And basically, it was kind of like their last resort at that point. And so they called Steve Jobs on the way to the airport after they got shut down in this meeting, and Steve Jobs wrote him a check. And that kind of kept it going so they can, obviously produce what they produced. So he had some great stories. And the other thing about the giving piece, so like a really good friend of mine, you talked about geeking out on Disney. So a good friend of mine, Dr. Scott Gray, um, geeks out on Disney. Okay. So I was like, hey, Scott, I have the co-founder of Pixar coming on. Do you want to come on and with me and ask questions? And so he was like, that'd be incredible. Thank you so much. And so Scott's one of my favorite people. He came on. So if you watch the video, you'll see Scott like knows everything. He's like, hey, Every Ray in the archives when blah, blah, blah. And I just let them geek out on Disney stuff. And I just sat back and listened because he knew everything from the archive. So that was a really fascinating one. Um, Obviously a amazing story of starting Pixar and beyond.
Yep.
There's, I had the funny thing is I had the founder of Atari on, and the same person who founded Atari founded Chuck E. Cheese, and Nolan Bushnell. And Nolan Bushnell was Steve Jobs' mentor, actually. And so he talks about Steve Jobs. And one of the things I discovered from my research is Steve Jobs offered Nolan 33% of Apple for $50,000 to Nolan Bushnell, right? He did not accept that. And I don't know how wealthy he would be if he owned 33% of Apple, but like maybe the wealthiest person. I don't know. I haven't done the math. And so I asked him, why did you say no? And I just get to ask people questions. And he was like, Jeremy, at that point in time, and I'm not gonna do it justice. People can listen to it if they want. Look up Nolan Bushnell and Inspired Insider. But he said, Jeremy, at that time, the equivalent of 50,000 was probably maybe like over 300,000. So he was, and if you had a random 21-year-old kid ask you to invest in their company for $300,000, would you give it to them? No one knew this would be Steve Jobs and Apple. Like, what are the odds, right? And so he said, you wouldn't give, I forgot what words he used, a punk 21-year-old kid $300,000, And I said, no, it was an obvious answer, right?
Gosh, that's
Um, but he had some incredible stories as far as that goes. And um, I can go on and on. I'll tell one last one, unless you care about certain genres. But I had Tony Horton, who P90X. If anyone's done the workout programs, they sold, I think, billions of dollars, so at least maybe $1 billion of uh, fitness programs and equipment. So Tony Horton, um, what was interesting is he basically early on, basically was able to survive with food and rent. So he drove cross country to follow his dream of being a personal trainer and being in the fitness industry. And when he got there, he, made his food and rent money he was a street mime. So he put a hat on the street and would do like, the miming thing. So I actually made him do that on the interview. I'm like, show me some mime stuff. And it was just kind of, it just reminded me, people, like a lot of these founders, they come from humble beginnings. We weren't born with it. They had to hustle for many, many years.
Hmm.
There's a story, the Einstein Bagels. No, the guy who started Noah's Bagels that sold to Einstein for over $100 million. What used to sell like religious tchotchkes out of his trunk. Like that's how he started. And so Noah Alper, just like humble beginnings. And so it always never ceases to amaze me. All these founders basically started this from scratch. At one point, they had zero clients, zero customers. Usually, they're not funded, right, until later. So, just amazing stories. It's inspirational for me because I'm like, I always feel like I should be further ahead than I am. And like, listen, all these people started with nothing essentially and scraped by and their blood, sweat, and tears until they finally, eventually 10 years later or more
Made it.
cracked it. Yeah.
Yep. That's so true. And it's like also your outreach is bold and I like it because you're kind of like, well, why do you not get any of the spotlight to the Pixar what's his name? He said,
Alvy Ray Smith. Yeah.
yeah, and he's like, oh, this guy's bold. I like it. I'll go on this
Well,
show.
I
Oh,
was I was genuinely curious, right? And sometimes it's like another one of my favorites is Chris Voss. Chris Voss wrote Never Split the Difference. He's an ex FBI hostage negotiator. So Danielle, you'll appreciate this. Like, so it's I don't know if you're familiar with Masterclass, if people are listening. Masterclass, they have like Serena Williams teaching tennis and Steph Curry teaching basketball. And so they have Chris Voss teaching negotiation in Masterclass. But early on, people are using the books obviously for business purpose, for various purposes. And so people are talking about it and telling me about it. I'm like, this sounds like an amazing book because he talks about negotiation and dealing with terrorists. And I'm like, okay, cool. But my thought process was not about business, it was about parenting, actually. And I was like, well, if he can deal with terrorists and talk them off a ledge, maybe I can use this to, my daughters are like, I won't put my coat on today. I'm like, maybe I could use some of the methodology and tactics there. So I actually got the book
they
from a
can be little
parent.
terrorists.
I got the book from a parenting perspective. And so, but he has some incredible stories in that book. And so he shared with them on the podcast on, trying to negotiate to get hostages back and some of the situations he was in. So, that was, and by the way, the funny thing is with his book, it wasn't, I wasn't expecting the message from what it was, right? His book is really about tactical empathy, when he's talking negotiation wise. And it's about seeing the other person's side and understanding the other person's side. And that's a lot of the things that he talks about, which is not what I was expecting out of the
Mhm.
book. So it's also, he has some great stories in there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I've I've watched Law and Order SVU, Criminal Minds. It's like talking to the people, those type of people, like it's always they can have like the empathy and the understanding piece in order to protect somebody's life. But it's like you don't think about that when you're thinking about a hostile environment like that. So I'm sure I'll have to look into that one. That's awesome.
I think you'll like it.
What was that?
I think you'll love that one. I mean, that's one of my personal favorites.
Yeah.
Never split the difference.
My husband would love that too. He would love that. Awesome. Well, to wrap it all up, we've been talking with Jeremy Weisz, owner and co-founder of Rise25. Can you tell the people where we can learn more about you?
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned a couple episodes. People can go on Inspired Insider, which inspiredinsider.com, which has all my episodes for free. Um, and obviously, you can find us on rise25.com. If you have questions, just message us. We have contact form there, and we see everything and respond within a day. So if you have any questions about anything, feel free. I'm also on LinkedIn if you want to connect there.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Jeremy. I really appreciate it.
This was
This is
great.
great. This was so great. Thank you so much.